Scott, now let's take a look at what's in your garage that everyone here is drooling about. Is this the best place to start?
Yeah, well, let's start here, Bernie, because this is sort of where I like to say it all got started. This particular car is a 1953 Jaguar Xk120. And you know, what's unique about this particular car is the fact that when it was created in probably about a week to two weeks' time. Jaguar was working on the XK engine. They had it done. They weren't quite ready to put it into their saloon car. Their saloon car wasn't ready. So Bill Lyons, who was in charge of Jaguar at the time, decided that, well, let's put it into a sports car, we'll put that on the motor show stand. And this is what he created, put the XK engine in it, and of course people just drooled over it. And the reason being is because this was much, much different post-war than the pre-war models. Now remember, most cars that came from post-war were nothing more than the pre-war models, exactly the same as the pre-war models, or maybe with slight differentiations. This was completely different. This was also what the GIs saw over in England. So upon coming home, this is what the GIs were clamoring for. And so this became a very, very popular car here in the States. You know, the glitterati of the day were the folks that were the type that would own these. You know, Clark Gable was known to have several of these cars. You know, and people of that particular, you know, Hollywood fame.
The Jaguar, this model Jaguar is what started a lot of the sports car, European sports car craze for everyone else to follow.
Oh, exactly. And they would actually race these particular cars. It's interesting to know that this car at that time was the fastest the fastest production car in the world. So what they did was they named this car the 120 because they thought, well, maybe it would go about 120 miles per hour. They weren't sure. So what they did was they had their chief test driver at the time, Sophie Sutton, take this car on a piece of the motorway in Belgium called the Jaguar Straight. And he was able to take this car down that straight at 132 miles per hour in its basic standard form. Okay. Now, what they did a little bit later was, because someone else was able to top that, Jaguar took a 120, modified it slightly at the front. They took the roof line off and they put a Perspex bubble on top. And their chief driver at the time, Norman Dewis, was able to take that car down that same area of the straightaway at 172 miles an hour. So here's Norman Dewis, okay, in a locked bubble top car. No seats, he was sitting on a block of wood going 172 miles an hour when most cars could only probably achieve about 60 to 70 miles per hour at best. He was doing close to more than three times that. So again, it's kind of a unique story about the XK120s. Let's talk a little bit about the E-types, because from the XK model line, in the XK lineup there was the 120, the 140, and then the 150. But really what a lot of individuals think of when they think of Jaguar is the E-type.
This is the one that made Enzo Ferrari very jealous.
It did, and Enzo Ferrari said it's one of the most beautiful cars that he'd ever seen. And so that's what we'll focus on here. Now when you look at the E-types, what they did, Bernie, is that you can divide the E-types into three basic series. You can divide it into a Series 1, a Series 2, and then a Series 3. Although some will say there's a Series 1.5, and I can touch on that for just a moment. But if you look at the Series 1 cars, the Series 1 cars had covered headlights, they had thin streamlined bumpers, they had streamed very thin lights and turn signal lights on the car. They had toggle switches inside. They also had eared spinners on the wired wheels. This particular car is a 1967 E-Type, and it's a 4.2 liter. Prior to this, and probably what's really, I would say, the car that's on fire right now for Jaguar are the early Series 1s, which were 3.8 liters. Not only were they 3.8 liters, but they had welded louvers in the bonnets, they had flat floors, and they had external bonnet lockets. If you have one of those cars, you really have something special. At one time, this was the what everyone clamored for, because it was a 4.2, it had the higher torqued engine, it also had a synchromesh gearbox, it had a much more comfortable seat. This is what people were gravitating towards as collectors, but not now. It's really the early Series 1 cars. Now, from this particular car, which is the Series 1...
From a design standpoint, where did the inspiration for this design? In other words, who did the clay on?
So what's interesting is a guy by the name of Malcolm Sayer is the gentleman who did the design work on this. Now, Malcolm Sayer was not a designer, but he was what they called an aerodynamicist. And that's a little bit different than a designer. So the way he developed this car was to plot points, okay, through a metric or a measurement type of means to come up with this basic shape. So that's where the shape of this car came from. And it's a very iconic shape, obviously.
Yes.
And in fact, if you look at this shape today, it still doesn't quite look out of place. You could look at this and say, yes, I could see it fitting in to today's genre of cars, which is much different, obviously, than an XK, which can look very dated. Now, the Series 2 cars ran from somewhere around 1969 into somewhere around 1970. Now, what's unique about this car is you'll see that it's a much more larger, bulkier type of car. So notice the bumpers are bigger. You'll notice the lights are different. They're a little bit bigger as well. Notice the covers on the lights, the headlights have come off. If you were to look inside, you would see that the toggle switches have been replaced with rocker switches. All of this was mandated by the United States federal government when it came to motor safety.
What year are we at this series?
So we're in somewhere around 1969. So you say, all right, so 67 was the last year of the Series 1. 69 is the Series 2. Well, what did they have in 68? And that's where that Series 1.5 designation came out. So they designed, or they sort of termed the 68 cars the Series 1.5, because you will see some pieces of the Series 1 cars on 68s, along with some of the pieces of the Series 2 cars. So for example, you might see the bumpers and the lighting of a Series 1, but you'll see the wire wheels and the uncovered headlights on a 68. So it sort of had a combination of both. And so people over time have collectively called that the Series 1.5. Jaguar never really did do that. They always called it a Series 1, Series 2, but over time that's where the Series 1.5 came into being. From the Series 2 car, which is still, this is a 1970, it's a 6-cylinder car. And this is a 74 E-Type. And of course, Bernie, this car is much different than what you see over here in the 67 line. This car was built on the 2+2 chassis, so it's a bigger chassis. This car, it has a V12 engine in it. It's a heavier car. Not only that, it has more creature comfort. So for example, it has power steering. It has air conditioning. This is more of a Grand Tourer type of car. So Jaguar was steadily moving away from that traditional sports car into a Grand Tourer of cars.
And this particular Grand Tourer did some touring with the second owner of yours.
Yeah. What's unique about this car? So the second owner of this car actually went up and down the coast of California with this car. And so when I looked at this car, it had a luggage rack on the back. And of course, I wasn't sure if that was standard or if it was an option or what have you. So I actually decided to start looking up the owners of these cars. So I found the second owner of the car. And when I located the second owner, I asked him a little bit about the car. And I asked him one of the things about the luggage rack. He said, I bought that luggage rack from the Jaguar dealership. and they installed it. So I kept the original luggage rack on that car for that reason. The other thing that he told me about this car is that he purchased wire wheels for the car, and at the time wire wheels were on the car. But he said originally it came with steel wheels. So because I like originality and I wanted to try to go back to originality, I went back with the steel wheels. But then there was an interesting piece in the file, Bernie, that I thought it caught my eye, because what it was a handwritten note. And it was written from a lady who basically was the first owner of this car. And what she did was she traded it in probably about 6 months to 8 months after owning it. She traded it in on a Cadillac Seville. And then this note says on it, I am the original owner of this car. I made a mistake and I sold the car and traded it in on a Cadillac Seville. Would you like to sell me this car back? And I have this letter in there, and the gentleman said to me, he said, yeah, one day I was in a shopping center and I found this note on my car. So I looked up the original lady who owned the car. I found her in California, and she confirmed that she wrote that note. It was a Safeway grocery store. She was there. She saw the car. She knew exactly it was her car. She said, I made a horrible mistake in trading my Jaguar in on a Cadillac, and she said, I hand wrote this note. I told the woman, I said, you know, I still have your note and can authenticate it. I said, you know, so it was an interesting story. She said it was the biggest mistake she probably made in her life. She said, I didn't care for the car at the time because I thought it was too big. I thought it, she said until I went to an American car, she said I didn't realize what I had and how wonderful the car was. And she said I tried to buy it back because I really liked the color combination. I really liked that car. And she said I was unsuccessful.
I love the steel wheels on it. That really sets it up.
Yeah. What came after the Series 3 E-Type, Jaguar introduced the XJS. Now, what's interesting about the XJS, and I'm going to show you, I have two XJS models here. I have a 92 XJS and I have a 96 XJS. But what's interesting about the XJS is when Jaguar left the E-Type, a lot of individuals were thinking that Jaguar was going to come out with another sports car. But what they did was they actually came out with another Grand Tour. And I want to show you these pieces on the back of this car. If you look at the pieces on the back of this car, Bernie, they call these the flying buttresses. So when this car first came out, people were in shock. They said, this is not an E-Type. This should not be the successor to the E-Type. It's got these awkward flying buttresses on it, and people really didn't like the car. And in fact, at one time in the XJS history of sales, Jaguar only sold probably a couple hundred of these cars in a year. And that's how low sales were. They were thinking of terminating the XJS model lineup. But eventually what happened was Jaguar started to make updates to the car, make some tiny tweaks to the back end, to the headlights, to the back lighting, and they actually started becoming more popular. And this is a 1996 Celebration model, and it again also has a very similar look to that. But you'll notice, being a convertible, it lacks the flying buttress look. This car also has a 6-cylinder engine, where that one had a 12-cylinder. But by the time this car was finally done, what had happened was Jaguar, the most cars ever produced, was of the XJS lineup. And I forget exactly how many it was, but it was their longest running line model that ran from 1975 all the way to 1996. Had some changes in between, don't get me wrong, but this car lasted from 75 to 96. What Jaguar came out with was under Ford's ownership was this particular model. And this is a 2003. They came out with this basic model in 96, 97. And this basic model ran from 97 all the way till 2006. And this particular model is a 2003 XKR. This car has the 4.2 liter supercharged engine with a top speed of 155 miles per hour.
Scott, so you've got two cars here that are somewhat similar in color, but they're several years apart. And you were telling us earlier that there's some history between these two?
Yeah, there is. And what's unique about this, Bernie, is the fact that, so this is a 1953, this is a 2003 model. My dad had retired in 2002, 2003. And one of the things that he wanted to do was to spend more time, doing fun things. So he wanted to go to car shows with me. So I purposely bought the Jaguar sports car of the day. And so we decided we were going to go to car shows together. And, you would think that he would drive this one and I would drive this one. But I drove this car, he would drive the 03. And we would park them side by side together. And what was nice about that is that it actually really showed the span of technology of Jaguar over so many years. In fact, what you can see here with the 120, there were two options to the 120. There was the windshield wiper washers, which was an option, and the heater was an option to this particular car. So it had two options. If you look at the 03, well, the list goes on with the 03. I mean, there's satellite navigation, heated seats, there's power reclining seats, a power top. It's just a big difference. And so individuals like to come up, they like to look at this car, compare it with that car, and note the difference in technology. 50 years apart between these cars.
And it's a nice father-son story.
And it does. It does make a nice story. We do have fun at the car shows.
Scott, within your collection, you've also got some saloon cars. Now, one of the things that you were explaining to us that designates between the Growler and the Leaper is a nice little bit of history there. So I was wondering if you could explain that to us again.
Sure, let's talk about that, because what you see here is the traditional Jaguar Leaper that was on and most people associate with Jaguar cars. But what's interesting about the Leaper is that, for the most part, the Leaper was really reserved for saloon cars. They did not put them on the sports cars. There was one sports car, and that was the Xk120, that you could order a Leaper for. So you will see 150s with Leapers on it, but traditionally you will not see an E-Type with a Leaper. The Leapers were always reserved for the saloon cars. Now, this particular model is an exciting model because, for two reasons. One is the fact that, and it's a 1967, it's a Mark II, but it's also a 340. And you say, well, how can it be both cars at the same time? Well, what's interesting is when I went to purchase this car, I looked at this car and I said, all right, it's got a Mark II bumper on it, on the front, it's got a Mark II bumper on the back. I looked at the back end and it said 340. It said it was badged as a 340. I looked at the wheel discs and I said, these are the wheel discs of a 340. I said, I wonder when they restored this, if someone did this incorrectly. So I called one of the gentlemen who's a historian with Jaguar cars, and that's Mike Cook over in Marque. And I said, Mike, I'm interested in purchasing a car. I said, can you do me a favor? I give you the serial number. I said, will you look this up and tell me what this car is? Is it a 340 and or is it a Mark II? So I got a call back from Mike, and I said, all right, Mike, what is it, a Mark II or a 340? He said, yes. I said, what does that mean? He said, it's both. So what's interesting about this car is one of 719 cars that were rebadged at the factory as 340s. Now I'm going to open this up for a second, and I'm going to pull out an article that was done shortly after I had contacted Mike. And so in the Jaguar Journal, they did an article on these rebadged cars. So what happened was, in the late 60s, they were switching over from the Mark II to the 340. It was very similar in appearance, but it did have some differences. The differences were it had a streamline or a thinner bumper. It also had different wheels and different things like that. So Jaguar was finding it very difficult in the late 60s to sell cars. So the West Coast dealers had asked the factory if they would rebadge some of the cars coming off the line as 340s so they could be the first ones to introduce them on the West Coast. And so that's what Jaguar did. They took 719 cars and they rebadged them as 340s. And that's what this article goes on to explain. Now, what's also interesting, and I found out with regards to this article, was the fact that most of the cars that were done were either black cars, red cars, or silver gray cars. There were only 2 cars that were rebadged at the factory that were in willow green. This is one of those cars because this is the original color. And there was only 1 car that was done in the pale primrose, which is the yellow of the E-Type that you saw a little bit earlier. The other thing that makes this car so exciting is the fact that this was the car that I lent to Jerry Seinfeld to do comedians in cars getting coffee. So it's kind of an interesting story. I get a phone call from the producers of the internet show, and they're looking for a Jaguar Mark II. They said they looked in New York for one, they looked in New Jersey, they looked in eastern Pennsylvania, they couldn't find one. And the reason being is because these were everyday transport cars. These were everyday 4-door cars that people transported. Although they were fast for the time, and they were the sports saloon at the time, most people used them, wore them out, and they ended up in junkyards and things like that. So they're looking for a Mark II. I told them that I happened to have one. And I sent a picture onto it, and of course, I come to learn later that Jerry Seinfeld loves the color green, and so the producer calls me back and says he loves your car, he wants to take it. And so what they did was they took Robert Klein, the comedian Robert Klein, for a ride in this car. And it turned out, as I was watching the clip, I also saw that this car, they took it to Sing Sing prison, where they're not supposed to be, and the car almost got impounded. Fortunately, it was Seinfeld that was driving the car, Bernie, and he talked his way out of it, so I did get the car back. But I'll share with you some articles that the Tribune and some signs that Jerry Seinfeld sent to me, which I think you will find interesting. A 1987 Vandenplow. Now, Vandenplow was the upscale version, okay, of the XJ6 at the time. Vandenplow was a car builder at the time, a coach builder, and so that's where this name comes from. But what's interesting about this car is, you know, after collecting Jaguars for a while, you know, yes, I do look for cars, but sometimes people come looking for me. And so I got a call from a friend in Michigan who said, I've got a Jaguar that you are absolutely going to love. You have to come see it. It's a great car. And I said, oh, great. I said, you know, what are we looking at? He said, we're looking at a 1987 Vandenplow. I said to him, I said, you know, the only problem is that's a big formal car. I said, that's a big, large 4-door sedan. I said, mostly what I collect are the Jaguar sports cars. I have a sports saloon. I said, but this was a large formal car. He said, Scott, you need to come up and hear the story about this and learn a little bit more about this car. He said, do you mind taking a ride? So I took a ride up, and I get there to find that this particular car was bought by a husband and wife. It was their dream car to have a Jaguar. They bought it in 1987. The sticker price on this car in 87 was $41,000. Now compare that with the sticker price of the top of the line Cadillac, which was a Seville, at $28,000. This car cost a lot of money. Well, what was interesting about this car is they bought it, they drove it for 1 year, they put about 15,000 miles on it, Bernie, and then her husband passed away. For the next 18 or so years, she drove it once a week around a lake at her home property just to keep the car exercised. So when I got there, I come to learn that the car only has 18,000 miles on it. No one has ever sat in the back seats. The leather still smells brand new. It's got plush lamb's wool carpeting in it. It's just the perfect car. Well, little did I know when I met the lady who owns the car that I was actually going through an interview process. You see, she had people come to her house, offer her money for it, but these were folks that wanted to sell it. These were folks that were not enthusiasts of Jaguar as I was. She asked me where I was going to store the car. I showed her a picture of this garage. When I showed her the picture of the garage, she said, "You're the type of person that will treat this car to the same level that me and my husband have treated it." She said, "I want someone who's enthusiastic about Jaguar, someone who's passionate about the car. I want someone like that to own this car." She said, "I will sell you the car." She said, and I haven't sold it, I told other people, no, I wouldn't sell it to them. She said, "I will sell you the car, but can you promise me that you will not resell it and that you will continue to love, enjoy, and cherish it?" And so I made that deal with her. I promised her that I would not sell it. So it sits here in this showroom of sports cars and sports saloons, but I made a promise to the previous owner, and it's a fabulous car. It always gets looks wherever it goes. And that's the story of this car.
Thank you very much, Scott. We really appreciate you giving us a bit of the history of Jaguar, your collection. I think that the viewers of the Pittsburgh Vintage Grand Prix this year are in for a real treat.
Well, you know, Bernie, being the Marque of the Year, and as a past president of the Jaguar Club, we are delighted to be participating. The Pittsburgh Vintage Grand Prix raises large sums of money for our charities. They do such great work. It's a real privilege and an honor for you to come out and to take a look and to see a little bit more about Jaguar. Thanks again for coming. Appreciate it.